hasn't been like we're not talking about the Gundam dance video or whatever, which is, some of you know about that, 1 billion views. But it's been out there. He's been able to kind of tell us his story, the story of his engagement with nature. So that hybrid experience is I think, illustrative of where we go forward here. And there's great power in all this. So I thank you. This is where we are, that tiny dot, and this is where I am. And I may have gone a little long, but hopefully we have time for at least a couple questions. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Well, we're going to do about 10-15 minutes of Q&A, and if you have a question for Mr. Rebkin, you can line up at the microphones and we'll take turns back and forth. And in the interest of time, I just ask you to not make speeches, just ask questions, and then we'll have time for as many as possible. Go ahead.
What's an optimal number of people on the planet for fresh water?
The question was, what's an optimal number of people on the planet for fresh water? As Joel Cohen from Rockefeller, Joel Cohen at Rockefeller University wrote the best book on population, which basically the title was How Many People Can the Earth Support? And he didn't answer it. He said, it depends. And the answer to your question is, it depends. If we have abundant, cheap energy, we can desalinate the ocean in ways that...
It doesn't work. It's filthy.
Well, no, it doesn't.
Don't even think about desalinization.
But
it does not work.
It does. Perth, Australia is getting 20% of its fresh water from wind-powered desalination
The
plants.
rest of the place does not.
Okay, it's complicated. There are parts, like in the Hudson River, you can't do it.
I know.
Okay, next question.
So I'm very impressed with the potentiality that you show with this communication thing. But what you're not discussing, of course, is how world society fits into this. The structure, world society, governments, nations, and the economic system, and how that's, it seems to me that's one of the biggest problems. That goes beyond just the potentiality of what technology, et cetera, can do. I'd like to hear your comments.
Yeah, this is an important issue, although I do think you're seeing, there are still some closed societies where communication is controlled. China is still largely controlled, although there's lots of end runs around information there too. And as the Chinese middle class grows, you're seeing much more information flowing. You're seeing China respond to environmental problems that it had neglected through its industrial burst of the last 10 years. So I think the nationhood issue and some of those corporate questions are going to fade in the power of some of these things that I'm talking about. Now, that doesn't mean Twitter has already been appropriated by people who just want to sell more stuff. So Twitter, these tools can be used for marketing and for making us want a bigger car just as much as they can be used for the things I'm talking about as well. So I'm not saying this is going to solve the world's problems. I'm saying it's giving the best chance of softening the journey, of making sure that the speed bumps are small and not walls. That's it. Yeah. Maybe here.
So you may or may not be aware that the current presumable representative of this congressional district in Illinois has been known to cite Genesis in talking about climate change. So my question is, what is known about how politicians respond to different sources of information regarding climate change? Is it similar to that information that reaches their constituents, or is it a second type of opinion source?
Well, politicians who are beholden to edge constituencies, the Tea Party being one, tend to torque their messaging and their policies toward those issues, whether it's on gun control or on emissions of greenhouse gases. I think there's not a lot of difference, or on abortion. And we're not, these issues are they are the structural questions about how the Senate supermajority means you have to get 60 votes to have some reasonable prospect of legislation moving forward, is the single biggest blockade to any progress, not just on issues like this, but on almost anything you can think of. And that could swing around and flip the other way. That's why no party, either the Democrats still in the Senate don't want to get rid of the 60-vote supermajority because they know someday it'll benefit them. But at the same time, is it benefiting society? I'm not so sure. So the structural issues with our politics are beyond this. Although what I think I see, like what I said about fracking, where the public, the community can essentially assemble its own databases, can make its own case for action, can make its own reports about violations, can press politicians to act in a certain way, and companies. Transparency International is an amazing organization globally that's fostering open flows of information on problems of various kinds. And that's a one-way street, I think. It's very hard to see us tamping down that tendency toward having more transparency, and that will swamp the power of sort of conventional politics to blockade action. And then I do still point back to those slides on energy. The questions you're talking about are mostly about global warming, which has become a badge. You have your NRA, your gun rights badge, your abortion badge, your global warming badge, and it's true for liberals as well. There's an identity factor around these issues. But if you can look at the discussion around investment in energy technologies, you get a little bit more buy-in from a larger community. One last place where there's an opportunity is on subsidies. The Heritage Foundation, one of the more conservative think tanks that's out there, wants to end energy subsidies. Now they want to end all of them, meaning for renewables as well, and start have a clean slate. And a lot of people concerned about fossil fuel subsidies would like to end all subsidies too. So at least there's overlap there. So I said, when you see overlap in divergent communities, that's the place to focus in on.
So I was recently at a conference where Hunter Levins talked about the virtualization of education and the growing use of MOOCs, and I forget what it stands for, but the online teaching, where the questions would be crowdsourced from the tens of thousands of people that were attending, and the answers as well, potentially, and her response to my question about, well, how do we make sure that the right information gets given to the people in class? Well, by the sheer number of right answers. And I'd see a big problem with counting on sheer numbers to teach people. So the whole online education, whether it's Wikipedia or MOOCs, what's going to happen with peer review and using books that get vetted?
Well, I think what you see online is everything gets vetted in the end. And I think there is the potential to have tools online that can be as valuable for education as the conventional textbook that goes through more formal review. Even in the science process, the old traditional peer review processes, there's been lots of revelations about how problematic that fairly young enterprise, the anonymous peer review, has revealed itself as not foolproof. I can't tell you how many papers I've reported on over the years that it got into a high impact journal that turned out to be wrong. And then the rebuttal papers pile up and don't get any attention. So online, this tendency to shift to the PLOS model of journals, Public Library of Science, you're going to see more of the sort of a later peer review, where the peer review will be partially public and instantaneous, and then partially more rigorous in traditional. And I think with education, it'll be the same way. You're going to see a move toward online learning. Inevitably. Now, that doesn't mean that campuses will lose meaning, because there's certain things you have, collaborative work, invention, having a relationship between a university and the businesses and the community around it. Like Rensselaer is a great example of a school. They have labs, invention labs, entrepreneurship labs, where they're working with the community to solve problems for businesses. That stuff is a function of a physical school in a physical place with physical relationships. So and that's why those of you in academia can feel confident there's still a role for the physical university. But it'll be more of a hub and spoke system and a hybrid form of learning where, like my son, just one last example, my son learned the After Effects software. He's taken classes at Pace and stuff like that, but he learned that by buying the software and then going on YouTube. And he's now pretty good at it. So skill stuff like learning calculus, learning After Effects, that doesn't have to happen in a classroom. So I think it'll be a hybrid kind of outcome. I can't remember.
I wonder if you you could say a little bit more about why it is that you think that traditional legal tools aren't working to help manage population-related environmental problems. Is it that you think they're not working, or just that we ought to be supplementing with these sort of soft law tools that...
Oh, okay. Well, we have this bad habit of the climate bill. Actually, there's a paper, if you go on, the Council on Foreign Relations is a really good blogger named Michael Levy. He's Energy Environment. He did a piece today on a new paper that I haven't had time to read yet myself, but it says if Waxman and Markey had passed, it kind of assesses, given the trajectories we see now in energy use, largely because of natural gas and other innovations, that the way the cap and trade bill was structured, we would end up in 2020 with higher emissions than we're going to end up with now without the bill. And it's because of all those aspects of negotiating a bill that lead to a very weak instrument. The same thing was happening with the climate treaty. There's so many out clauses that it is soft law in the end anyway. And I see the treaty process still has value. Getting all the world's countries together to articulate their definition of the climate problem, which is different from Ethiopia than it is for the Inuit, is immensely valuable. And it's a place to articulate what you're doing. It's a place to sort of demarcate, this is where we're going. And that alone can build us some progress. But the idea that we're going to have a firm cap on carbon at the national level or at the global level that's meaningful is, to me, I think that's ancient history. I'll give you one last example. Australia got a lot of great press for enacting a carbon cap. But they're also exporting millions of tons of coal to China that isn't accounted for in their domestic cap. And to me, that is complete hypocrisy. You can't, and they're saying, the response is, well, no, it's China's responsibility. You account for the emissions where the emissions are, not where the coal came from. And I think for a rich country to claim credit for having a carbon cap while it's sending its carbon to China to burn is ridiculous. So that's my thinking.
Last question.
Okay.
Well, thank you very much. It was an honor to listen to you speak, and I appreciate you coming here. So, one thing I noticed with your graph of the population, the ski jump, if you were to put that on arbitrary scales in the past, whatever, you'd see a lot of ski jumps. You'd also see a lot of crashes, both for human population and biodiversity. And one thing I've also noticed is, like the International Panel on Climate Change, when they put out future projections, they never really consider that. If there was a population crash, there would be some uptake of carbon. I was just curious, do you know why people don't really look at that? Or do you know anybody who is considering those types of scenarios?
Yeah, there's a guy named Brian O'Neill at University of Colorado. He was at IASA, the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis in Austria. IASA does a lot of work of that sort. Much more detail on population trends and how they relate to things like carbon. So I could follow up with you later if you want. But Brian O'Neill has done some really good work on that point, exactly what you're talking about, taking more account for population change, fertility rates. And that's...
Thank you. I think through his blog, we can continue this conversation that we just begun here today. I'm going to turn it over to Bill Schultz.
Thank you very much, Andrew, Andy. I think you've given us all a lot of food for thought. We're going to have a reception out here. It's actually going on now, and perhaps you can talk to Andy briefly out there before we leave. And in appreciation of your presentation today, we have a small token of our appreciation from the Prairie Research Institute.
Thank you very much. So with that, I think we can go out to the foyer and mix. Take off my device. Oh, great. Great.
Just want to say hi real fast.
Yeah.
Kala. I helped run the carbon capture report. You wrote about this one time.
Oh, okay.
Once upon a time.
I'm going out to see the CCS The Decatur thing tomorrow?
Oh, okay. Yeah, my dad is.
Yeah.
I worked on that one.
Oh, you did? All right.
As a geologist, so we just wanted to. Yeah, the carbon capture report. We're continuing doing some expansion. We're actually doing some real interesting spatial work now. I'm trying to look on